Now I'm remembering to press record.
There you go. Listen, we don't all have the support of Hamish, the man, the myth, the legend. But with that in mind, we are now live. So,
Good.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How are you all on this fair and fine late and rather showery April evening? We're Scots at War, and over the next 45 minutes to an hour, we're going to be discussing some of our favourite Scottish regiments and battalions. We're going to be looking into the reasons why we were originally drawn to study these individual units, and we're going to be having a little look at some of their famous actions, some of their famous personalities, and ways in which we can support and encourage you people out there to find out about your own favourite unit. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about the Queen's Edinburgh Rifles. Again, my poor wife, Mrs. Clarke, has had me basically screeching on about the Queen's Edinburgh Rifles for the guts of 15 years now, God bless her. We talked a little bit about the 4th and 5th Royal Scots in our Gallipoli special a couple of weeks back, but we'll dive back and have a little look at them. Chaps, which battalion or which regiment are you going to be looking at bringing to the table?
I think
I'm going to be... Yeah. Oh, on you go, Jim.
That's keen.
No, I was going to say I think Rowan should go first because I think we all know what he's going to say.
Yeah, I'm going to be talking about the 1st Battalion, the Royal Highlanders, or Black Watch.
Or 42nd.
Yeah, or 42nd, yeah. Depending on literally whatever you want to call them at the time. It changes so many times.
It's 1914. Call them whatever you want.
Yeah, it literally is. None of the officers could decide what they wanted to call it, even in their official correspondence. But yeah, that's basically,
I imagine.
Yeah, it's basically my obsession, particularly in the very early war period. So yeah,
happy days, Jim.
Yeah, I obviously these two chaps with their connections to Edinburgh and the land beyond, otherwise known as Fife. Are some local connections, but for me, I wrote my master's thesis on the entire regiment, the Cameroonians, the Scottish Rifles. But while living in Glasgow, writing that thesis, I actually lived right next door to the headquarters of the 5th Scottish Rifles. So they quickly became my favorite battalion to study.
Happy days. So I'll just kick us off with a little bit about my own beloved Queen's Edinburgh Rifles. Now, I think I said this when we were looking at our Gallipoli special a few weeks back. I was actually walking around the cemetery in Leith, as you do, and I kept on seeing all like these local family headstones, and also in memory of my son, Private XYZ, killed 28th of June 1915, and then the 3 initials QER. And to be perfectly honest, I'd only really moved to Scotland and only moved to Edinburgh just a few months before that. So I was a wee bit intrigued as to what the 28th of June, what was going on there, and especially what QER was. Very quickly found out that this was Queen's Edinburgh Rifles. And from there onwards, I basically disappeared down a rabbit hole. Now, I'll try and just share a wee screen with you here, if I can. And this, for me, really, is what the Queen's Edinburgh Rifles are all about to me. Now, obviously, this was a brigade to start off with, 2 battalions that were part of the 1st Regiment of Foot, the Royal Scots. And whilst they were always very proud of the fact that they were part of the oldest infantry regiment in the British Army there, they were also very, very proud of the fact that they'd styled themselves as rifles. Now, this was a unit that was raised in 1859 in response to the supposed French invasion threat, very much in the same sort of mould as the London Scottish and the other volunteer rifle units that emerged at that time. But over the years, some of those identities seem to fade away, and that really wasn't the case for the 4th and 5th Royal Scots as they became. As you can see in the picture here, these chaps, despite being part of 2 territorial battalions eventually of a line regiment, still aggressively held on to their rifles affiliation, and it's that sort of split personality that really, really drew me to them. As you can see, they're wearing their Glengarrys there. They look like they're black in the picture, but they're actually sort of like a very, very dark bluish bottle green. We can still see the chaps are wearing their black rifle buttons, and these were actually carried to Gallipoli with them. They still wore their black and green rifle stripes. They certainly survived as far as Malta, and there's some quite rare photographic evidence to say that these black stripes were actually worn in Gallipoli. A bit unusual because most of the rifle regiments were quickly standardized onto like what you might call like the plain army tapes. Nice little thing that I've never ever seen there before. I think that's one of the rare qualified stretcher bearer badges, quite a short-lived badge there. And we can see at the bottom the black and brass titles, Territorial Battalion, Queen's Edinburgh Rifles, but also simultaneously Royal Scots, this weird sort of dual identity that these chaps really seem to revel in. And I love spending ridiculously expensive amounts of money on these beautiful camp scenes that we can see here. They often have amusing little titles underneath them, like the dog's home and all that sort of stuff. This is a wonderful picture that's taken in Stobbs Camp, probably just a few days before the outbreak of the First World War, before these chaps were mobilised.
That's a great.
Sorry, Jim.
I have a question. I know I'm supposed to be for the audience, but I've never seen the chap that was kneeling on the left. He had a white kind of circular patch. What is that?
That one there?
Yeah.
That, I believe, and I will probably be corrected within moments, is the stretcher bearer's badge. The qualified stretcher bearer's badge, of which hopefully we'll be able to dig a picture of. Okay, I think they were quite a short-lived badge and didn't last very long, so quite a nice thing to see there. One of the things that really drew me to the Queen's Edinburgh Rifles is how deeply you can research some of the chaps here. Now, obviously, as you might expect in your standard territorial battalion, the officers will be quite researchable, as most officers in most battalions are. Obviously, all the officers in the Queen's Edinburgh Rifles were drawn from the Edinburgh commercial classes, sort of like the bankers, the solicitors, all that sort of stuff. But one of the most interesting things about the Queen's was the fact that they actually had companies for different trades. So you would get high-ranking, high-powered bankers, solicitors, clerks, writers to the signet, people like that actually serving in the ranks, but within their own sort of almost sort of segregated company, for the want of a better word. So what I find very interesting is that any of the chaps that you might see in the back row there with the stripes on could quite easily, in any other sort of territorial battalion, in any other sort of time or place, actually have taken a commission. And it's often this fascinating thing that I like is why one man of an equal rank, equal standing in civilian life can salute a chap who he may well be sort of like the boss of in civilian life there. So quite a fascinating thing there. One of the nice things about the Queen's Edinburgh Rifles is that they leave their mark all over Edinburgh. And as you can see here, this is the old drill hall on Forest Hill in Edinburgh. If you've ever visited Edinburgh, it's just a couple of moments walk away from a wonderful pub called Sandy Bell's. And the facade of the drill hall was actually refurbished by the University of Edinburgh a few years back. So we can see Queen's Rifle Volunteer Brigade, the Royal Scots headquarters, with the arms of Edinburgh to one side and the Royal Scots badge on the other. If we're going to get very sniffy about this, this is obviously the standard Royal Scots badge. Another one of the things that I really, really like about the 4th and 5th is that they actually had their own badge that you can see on the screen there. Interesting that they've chosen the Order of the Thistle, which is technically the Royal Scots officer's badge with the strung bugle underneath it. And as I said before, you can really get in detail and in depth and start to recover some of the personal stories of these chaps, even down to the lance corporals, the privates. There's a lot of good photographic evidence for these battalions as well, the 4th and 5th. Obviously, there was a fair amount of money sloshing about in this battalion. For example, you needed £1 at one point to actually take a position in the battalion, and you needed to be voted into it. Essentially, you couldn't really just stroll up in the pre-war years. You needed an existing member to propose your membership and another person to second that.
That's even in private, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Because the kit was quite expensive, and obviously in terms of arms and ammunition, there was the sort of unwritten rule that you would actually have to pay for quite a lot of your own firing kit. So there was an element of almost like a private shooting club in this as well. So as you can imagine, there's a fair amount of money sloshing about in the battalion. So there are quite nice photographs of them. Here we can actually see some of the officers, I believe with regulars of the Hampshire Regiment, who are heading out to Gallipoli. This is actually the troop ship that they're heading out to the Dardanelles in. One of the really nice things here is a lot of the members were drawn from the local schools and from the University of Edinburgh, and as a result of that, the school rolls of honour and the university rolls of honour can provide an absolutely wonderful resource to reconstruct some of the members' early lives. Here's one of my favourite lads. This is George Downey, aged about 14 or 15 when he was a piper here at Daniel Stewart's College in Edinburgh. And I've actually juxtaposed these two pictures, which are from about the same time, about 1910 or so, because here we see young George. This is the school that he would have been going into on a daily basis. But here today, just in this position here, stands the school war memorial that unfortunately George, bless him, is on. I was actually very fortunate to be able to find George's attestation papers. Here we see him signing up at the age of 17 years and 9 months, and he gives his trade or calling as an engineer, again signing up as a private, whereas actually he was soon to be a partner in his father's engineering firm in Haymarket in Edinburgh. So, a young gentleman of quite some standing. And basically going through research and reading through the papers, there are lots of really good local newspapers in Edinburgh. I found that George actually lost his life on the same day as the attack that we were describing a couple of weeks back in Captain Muir's book, The Attack on Fir Tree Wood. And he actually volunteered to deliver a message on motorcycle through a Turkish bombardment to try and get reinforcements and artillery support drawn on the wood for his battalion. And again, it's very, very poignant that we see here the objects that were taken off his body. He was only 18 when he was in Gallipoli, and there we see, second down on the list there, his motor driver's licence. Quite unusual for a young private from Edinburgh to have a driver's licence and his own motorbike. He actually took his own cycle and allowed it to be used for use in the battalion. There we can see his father's business, his dad Andrew Downey signing, being listed as his next of kin on his attestation papers, and then a few years later his father signing for his 1915 Star War and Victory Medal and his plaque and commemorative scroll. So these are just, obviously Andrew Downey there and his son George is just one of literally thousands of individual personal stories that over the years I've been able to uncover about the Queen's Edinburgh Rifles. And it's this deep connection with the city that I now call home that makes the Queen's Edinburgh as the 4th and 5th Battalion probably my favourite battalion that I'll ever come across. I love them to bits.
It's really cool. I've always been kind of taken aback when we go and visit Edinburgh over the stories you hear, not only from their battalion, but from the other local battalions in Edinburgh.
Yeah.
And just the impact that they have in small sites. I mean, you've taken me to the pub, the Shady Bell, and to the headquarters, and I'm sure too. But then there's the small, like, climbing up Arthur's Seat. Wasn't that their firing range for a while?
Yeah, absolutely. Hunter's Bog firing range, which is now out in what is now Arthur's Seat. It's Holyrood Park, essentially. It's a historic Scotland property, beautiful country park in the middle of Edinburgh. Walking through Hunter's Bog, you can pick up, because that was used as a firing range from the late 1850s onwards, everything from Brown Bess musket balls, Schneider rounds, Martini Henry rounds, right the way through to sort of like the heavy copper-jacketed rounds from the Boer War era, right up to the Mark 7 rounds that the lads would have been firing just before they were deployed to Gallipoli. And the ground up there is still littered with these spent rounds and spent cartridges that were fired by the Queen's Edinburgh Rifles. A good friend of mine was up there a few days back and showed me a handful of Martini Henry slugs that he picked up literally off one of the paths that had just eroded through the soil, hundreds of people walking up there, and they just come to the top. So it's a really tangible piece of evidence there.
That's and it's interesting. I'll be talking about a territorial battalion as well, but first I think it would be interesting to put Rowan on the spot and ask a little bit about his favorite battalion, which is not the regulars.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the funny thing is, when I first got into the sort of living history and reenactment side of things, I was quite interested in territorial battalions. I'd always been interested in the Black Watch, because that's my local area where I come from, and I was interested in the 7th Fife Territorial Battalion. But the problem with that is that they didn't do an awful lot in the war. They were on the Western Front and that's not to depreciate from anything, they still had terrible losses.
Everybody in the Fife counties are now just going to come right down on top of you.
Yeah, no, I mean they did plenty, but the problem was that they were out in France from May 1915 right through to the end of 1918. But they were in the 51st Highland Division, in the same brigade as the 6th Perthshire Battalion of Black Watch. And effectively, every battle, particularly at the Somme and Arras, we see it, the 6th is sort of the one that goes into the attack, and the 7th come up behind them and mop stuff up afterwards. So with my local territorial battalion, it's still a very interesting story. It's not as well documented, not as well photographed as the 6th. And the 6th is still interesting because I was born in Perth as well. But so yeah, the territorial story wasn't quite as interesting for me. And I studied at the University of Dundee, so I had a bit of an interest in the 4th Battalion. But all the research on that's kind of been done to death.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's very well known, the 4th Black Watch, isn't it? Yeah.
Because of the Lewes connection, how that affected the city. But so I just started to, basically a few years ago, started to look at the first battalion, what the regulars were doing, because my main interest was this beginning period, particularly the retreat from Mons in 1914 and the mobilisation before that. And the 1st Battalion is right at the forefront of that. If I share my screen here, just a minute. Yeah, that should be working. This is really useful because we actually have a picture, if it goes, of the entire battalion. Can you guys see that?
Oh, there you go. We're through now, mate. Yeah,
brilliant,
it's a beautiful picture, this one, yeah.
So we actually, it's kind of a reasonably rare occurrence that we actually have a picture in reasonable detail of the entire battalion before they go to France. And you can see this is the very quintessential battalion of 1914. You have their pipes and drums with them. If you were to zoom in on the pipers, which has been done on a better quality photo of this, you'll see them still carrying dirks and revolvers. All the company commanders and one field officer technically, on their horses. The scout section here with their cyclists, and right at the back, a number of different carts and wagons and the machine gun limbers. So everything that we have in this period is very much organized for this period of mobile warfare in 1914. Just a minute, where's the next one? It's gonna work. Nope, it's not. Slight technical problem while that won't zoom in.
There's
I can see a certain Miss Duff. Am I correct?
Yes, that's what I'm going to come on to.
In the centre of the photo, there,
the reason
a very welcome addition.
Yes, the reason it's, I don't know why that's so blurry. It wasn't blurry earlier today, but I'll show a better picture of the man himself in a minute. But these are the officers on the day they embarked for France, and this man in the middle is Lieutenant Colonel Adrienne Duff, and he is probably my favourite soldier of the entire war. Basically, he
fair enough. Actually, fair enough. I'll give you that one.
Yeah, and that is also my background. I could have just shown you that.
Which is fine.
Yeah. But yeah, so this is Adrienne Duff. He, as I say, no, it isn't. Where's he gone? I'm really terrible at this. But yes, he's my favourite soldier of the entire war, even though he really only lasts less than 2 months. He is killed on, well, much less than that. He's killed on the 14th of September 1914 at the Battle of the Aisne. But what he actually contributes to the war is done between basically in 1911, 1912 into 1913, where he works for the War Office and writes what's called the War Book, and it has a very long title which I can't remember, but basically it is the mobilization or the plan for in the event of war or any hostile action by another major European power. They were pointing the finger at Germany, but they wouldn't actually say Germany at that point. And basically he wrote this massive book outlining exactly how the army was going to go to war, and basically just decided for everyone how it was going to happen. And it's amazing to think about what would have happened if we hadn't actually had Grant Duff. For example, there was one problem that I identified, that there were people, there was a department in Whitehall which didn't employ people to answer phones in the evening. So if the enemy attacked at night, that department and everything it was responsible for, basically right down to the deployment of the army, wouldn't know until the next morning. It was just, ridiculous things like that, breakdowns in communication, which he managed to solve, and meant that in 1914 the whole regular army could actually deploy overseas within effectively a week and less.
Yeah.
So yeah, but
I still love that picture of him there on the day of embarkation, where he's just sitting there seemingly unperturbed by the fact that he's now following pretty much his own plan to go to war. And he is unperturbed because everything was planned, as you were saying, down to more or less the last minute, and all these battalions had to do was open the drawer, open the book, and do it.
Yeah, and it's not just him. There are some pretty amazing characters in this. It's really annoying that this photo is so blurry now. But for example, on the side, the right-hand side, standing, or their right, you have Lieutenant Victor Fortune, later General Victor Fortune in the Second World War. Sitting just in front of him, you have Major Lord George Stuart Murray, who was the brother of the Marquis of Tullibardine, who started the Scottish Horse in the Boer War. To Grant Duff's left, you have Lieutenant Francis Anderson, who by November had an MC, by the end of the war had a DSO and bar, and was commanding the battalion. Had essentially moved one seat along and 4 ranks up. And just various people. We also have another man, Captain Amory, there, who was a very important figure in the Egyptian army before the war. Basically, everyone here is extremely professional soldier. One of the interesting facts, well, 2 interesting facts about this battalion as well, is that of the officers, 93% of them were Scottish, which is something we talked about last week, rapidly becomes less of a feature in Scottish battalions, that hardly any of them are Scottish, or actually Scottish. And also, at least 2 of them were not publicly educated, which is quite rare for a regular battalion in 1914, and Dave won't like very much.
I'm getting character assassination here, yeah. But it's very, very interesting, you know, to compare that with the Queen's Edinburgh Rifles, as we were saying there, where, you know, as we were saying, one of the reasons why they are so, to me, interesting is because you can literally go to their school magazine, whether that be obviously the 5th had a really big Heriots connection, the 4th had a really big George Watson's connection, and you can go to their website, you know, to the school websites, you know, which are really good, into their archive section, and you can find out incredible details about these people, you know. So yeah, that certainly is, you know, to me very, very interesting, because we just think First Black Watch, these guys are going to be at the really top tier of the, you know, the Scottish and English public schools as well. Yeah. So to hear that, I must admit I didn't know that. That's very, very.
Yeah, it's just the thing that they are have effectively ended up in this battalion through being the best soldiers selected, not through being, you know, by birth or anything, which I just really like for this period.
We actually have
it's quite unusual.
Questions about this photograph. First off, is by the end of 1914, or by the end of the war, even depending on what we know here, how many of these guys are left?
I can answer that very easily. By November 1914, 1 Lieutenant Fortune.
Yeah, the man standing far left.
Yes, yeah.
So that's after Mons, the Aisne, and First Deep.
Yeah, and the Marne, yeah.
In the Marne,
yeah.
Which I think is fascinating.
But, sorry, we should also just realise that these men didn't take part in the Battle of Mons. They basically were right out on the, well, not quite on the flank of the army, but quite far, and basically got to sort of on a latitude with Mons, and then got told to turn around, and then spent the next month just being continually harassed by cavalry and not really knowing what had gone wrong.
Yeah, a lot of hard marching there. Yeah, a lot of hard marching on paved roads in the baking sunlight in Highland Brogues. Not massively pleasant.
Yeah.
Not that any of us on this stream have ever tried to do that or anything. But,
I did that route last year, but in modern kit, and I did it in reverse, basically. And yeah, it wasn't nice.
Yeah, it's enough, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
But the other question we have is, was it not common for someone like Duff, who was only a lieutenant colonel, to make these plans on such a large scale for the whole army?
Well, that's quite an interesting thing. I can't remember exactly what his department was called, but it was something that was only set up in 1911, I think. And he wasn't in command of the department by any means, but the commander of his sort of office, his department, was a naval captain, I think, so the equivalent of a full colonel. But he recognized, he basically took a step back and said to Grant Duff, "You have a lot more experience than me, you know, in actual warfare in the field," because Grant Duff had been through the Boer War. He'd been through several. He'd been on the northwest frontier.
Yeah,
he'd been in Burma. I think he'd been in Burma as well. He'd been all over the place. So yeah, basically he was a relatively low rank, but his seniors ended up sort of letting him do it because they recognized that he was had this incredibly brilliant tactical mind, effectively, and organizational skills, and it worked. I mean, I think I'm a bit obsessed with him, but really that's basically what happened.
But this is the whole thing, as we've said in jest before, and obviously not wanting to let the cat out of the bag, he's got first dibs on it. But it astonishes me why there's not been a biography of this. Do you know what I mean? There's not more in print about. One of the pivotal figures in taking the BEF to war in 1914. Going back, a couple of weeks back to Captain Muir's book there, Albert Muir. The opening page of his memoirs is the telephone rings, and somebody says, "Is that the 5th Royal Scots?" "Yes, the 5th Royal Scots." "Mobilise." Phone goes down, and they just go, "Okay," and they just go and do it. And it's because essentially of the central figure that you see there, like quite incredible.
Yeah, that literally is how it works, and Oh, I've lost my thread now. Where was I going with that? What was your question, Jim?
Well, no, it was actually it was from our dear friend Barry Duncan, who'll be getting another shout out again. But it was was it uncommon for someone of his rank to be making such high level decisions?
All right, yeah. So yeah, just that he had that amount of experience in his seniors, recognised that. But I think it was his own request to go back to his battalion in 1913, basically because his job was done. And although he'd served right through the Boer, well, he answered right through the Boer War, because the first Black Watch were a little bit late getting out there, but he'd served through several campaigns. He always felt that his military career hadn't advanced as far as it should have, really, by that point. And I think some of his contemporaries felt that as well, for the amount of experience that he had. But in terms of what Dave was saying for the biography, there is one quite good journal article by, Jim, help me out here. The Journal of Army Historical Research. I may have said those words in the wrong order.
Army Historical Research.
Yes, that one. Yeah, so there's a good article from, I think, about 2009 on him from that, which is really interesting. So if you can get access to that, I mean, it's great to read. But apart from that, there's very little. And also, if you try and Google him, it just comes up with his dad, who was a politician. So it doesn't help that much. But otherwise, just about him, obviously this is about the battalion as a whole, but he's just quite an interesting character. He was a very different, he was a very different person from the previous CO that the battalions had. I forget what his name was, but basically he was very much about sort of hard fighting, sport being an integral part of the battalion. And Grant Duff comes. He was quite big in temperance associations when he was stationed out in India. He's quite
I've just got right off him. Yeah.
Mild-mannered, very different person. He is more, I think, if I had to sort of describe this sort of type of soldier, he'd be more about fighting with fire than the bayonet, being more tactical thinking. And he impresses that upon his officers. So they do a lot of training in this period, because the Black Watch in 1912 gets moved into the 1st Division, or 1st Guards Brigade at Aldershot. And that's why they're essentially one of the first to go over to France, and why Grant Duff again is put right at the front of the war effort, effectively. And they perform very well in the 1913 army maneuvers and the combined training period, things like that. So, yeah, basically, the reason I find them so interesting is just because they embody everything that is great about the BEF in this period, and they are just a brilliant case study of the effectively of when things go right. And that is basically the subject of my undergraduate dissertation now, is the effectiveness of this battalion and what it can tell us about the BEF in the pre-war and the early 1914 period.
Yeah, I think that is Dr. Neil McLennan wanted to let you know in the comments that you've definitely got a master's or PhD thesis in here. We're all, and a book. As we all mentioned the biography, we're of course all waiting you to write it. Every time I hear you speak about this, because this isn't the first time, believe it or not, that you've mentioned the Black Watch and the 1st Battalion in particular, I'm always taken aback by this photograph in particular.
I wish I had a better quality one here, but
we'll be sending, a few people in the comments have asked for links to it, so we'll post a link to a higher res version of it after the live stream.
I mean, it's literally because that one there is one that I've scanned out of the battalion's war history. Yeah. Incidentally, it's another thing about this battalion, that the war history was published in 1925 in 3 volumes, one for regulars, one for territorials, one for reserves. But it's only just quite recently been brought out in a kind of more affordable format. Is quite hard to get, unfortunately. And I've got a set of first editions which cost me, I'm not going to say how much it cost me because it still hurts me, but it's
pounds.
Yeah,
all the pounds that never existed.
Yeah.
But I think the interesting thing about this photograph in particular is when you describe the men who are in it, this is what becomes the leadership not only of the Scottish military experience, but of the British military through the 20th century. And I feel like they might all not be in this particular battalion or in this particular photograph, but between Duff, Fortune, the Taub and Ruadhán son, who, if anybody visits Blair Athol, there's a really cool part of the exhibit where they actually talk about him, because he was killed and his brother was a POW, or was it the other way? He was killed, correct?
I don't know. Dave should know. Dave really should know, because he's the only person who knows about the Scottish horse, really.
Oh, that's for the Salonica one we're doing.
Oh, I see. Okay, yeah, we'll save that. We'll save that information. Yeah.
Save that. But all these guys come from these interesting Scottish families, both military families or family with political connections, and I think this photograph really encapsulates where Scotland's leadership is heading into the 20th century. That's always kind of fascinating me. Yeah,
that's really why it is interesting. You have these guys who there's a lord in there. There's very sort of son of a politician, obviously. But then again, there's I think it's a major and a lieutenant in there. I cannot remember who they are, but who weren't even privately educated, and there's a couple of sons of the clergy and stuff, but mainly they're actually sort of generally middle class, sort of professionals, rather than just there by entitlement, which I think is something that gets overlooked often about that is one of these the features of the British Expeditionary Force, is that they are the best professional soldiers of their age, not just public school boys who've ended up in uniform there.
Yeah. No, I think, it's really, really can't wait for your. Well, we're going to have you've given me an idea that we might have to have a different episode solely on individuals. We might have to have a Duff episode.
Yeah, I might have to. It's been slightly garbled because usually I would have something written in front of me of what I'm doing, and I don't have that this week, so I'm kind of going back on myself a little bit and making stuff up. But yes,
don't worry about it. Jim, we've already been hearing about the premier 5th Battalion of a regiment, which happened to be Rifles. So tell us about the second best, or what.
Of course. Well,
the God's Own, were they called? Am I right in thinking that? There's a wee bit of beef there, wasn't there? God's Own, 5th God's Own Battalion. Ooh.
Yeah, I would be hesitant to call them the second when they come from Scotland's first city.
Fire!
When they come, they come from such a very interesting background, and it is interesting when you compare, say, and I do really like to compare the Queen's Edinburgh Rifles with the 5th Cameroonian Scottish Rifles, because they do kind of encapsulate the different worlds of Glasgow and Edinburgh, and also the different worlds of Scottish society at the time, because Glasgow as a whole had various territorial battalions. In the west end of Glasgow, you had a number. You had the 5th Cameroonians Scottish Rifles. You had the 9th Highland Light Infantry, the Glasgow Highlanders, whose headquarters wasn't too far away. You had the 6th Highland Light Infantry, which was the 6th and the 9th happened to be the 2 kilted battalions of the HLI. So
that's the thing with Edinburgh. If you're a territorial in Edinburgh, you're basically Royal Scots. There wasn't that. Oh, I could be Cameroonians. It could be Highland Light Infantry here, and that's an interesting dynamic.
I think, and it really shows that there's a lot of strife. Just like today, we still talk about the ramifications of sectarianism. In Scotland, it exists at the time too, and these territorial battalions, whether you're in a Scottish lowland city or in other cities talking about different issues, King's Liverpool is another good example of different societies still, fulfilling what at the time was considered to be everyone's patriotic duty, but also still fighting for their particular cause or their particular, ideals. And so that's really represented within the Glaswegian territorial battalions. Now, it's really important because I've had a lot of questions about not only the 5th Cameroonians, but all of the battalions. The Cameroonians, Scottish Rifles, it's one regimental title. Scottish Rifles are in parentheses. They are not the same regiment as the Cameron Highlanders or the Camerons. different regiments, quite often confused for one another. The Camerons were the old 79th and recruited out of Inverness in the far north, where the Cameroonians, the old 26th and the 90th, recruit out of Lanark and Greater Lanarkshire. So you're always going to have this strife with the Cameroonians and the Highland Light Infantry because they're both given very close recruitment areas. Yeah. Really, when we say Lanarkshire, we mean the city of Glasgow. That's where most of the population is. Though you have battalions like the 6th Cameroonians, which are headquartered in Hamilton. Hamilton Barracks was the headquarters for both the HLI and the Scottish Rifles. You have a lot of different sort of interactions. But focusing back on the 5th Cameroonians, the reason I mentioned before that I got interested in them was because I lived literally down the street from their their headquarters, which is at 261 Princes Street. If you're walking down now, I believe it's a ballet studio now, but the original building still stands. And not far away from there, at one of the greatest city parks in Scotland, in Kelvin Grove Park, is the regimental memorial to the Cameroonians, the Scottish Rifles, which covers more than just their First World War service. But they have a history that's very similar to the 5th Royal Scots, following this whole territorial movement. They're raised and are designated as the 1st Lanarkshire Rifle Volunteers, which becomes the 1st Glasgow Western. And their real center of power, the area of Glasgow where they really recruit heavily from, is what's now the Great Western Road area. So sort of in that intersection with Partick in the northwest side of the city. And I'm actually going to bring up some photos here as well. If we start my screen sharing. Let's go to photos. Oh, yeah. Everybody see those cool guys?
Oh, there you go.
So this is from the original recruitment of when they were the Lanarkshire Rifle Volunteers. And there's several battalions of the Lanarkshire Rifle Volunteers that are raised, but again, raised in the late 1850s, early 1860s due to that threat of French invasion. And this is part of the overall rifle volunteer movement, which is taking place throughout the United Kingdom. So you've got, this is their original uniform with their P83 Enfield rifles. I love posting this photo a lot because as an American, everybody thinks I'm posting photos of Confederate soldiers from the Civil War, but they're not. But they'll continue on to be a part of Scottish life and Glaswegian life through the rest of the 19th century, and particularly because of the location of the battalion, they're going to form a really close connection to Glasgow University. During the war itself, Glasgow University is going to raise a company that becomes B Company of the 6th Cameron Highlanders, but there's actually more men with university connections in the Cameroonians. Cameroonians in the HLI, being the local regiments, claim way more men, and particularly the 5th. A lot of staff from the university were members of the 5th. Lord Kelvin was an officer in the 5th, and very similar to the 5th Royal Scots, 4th, 5th Royal Scots, Queen's Edinburgh Rifles, there was a purchase system to get in. However, you were expected that if you wanted to be an officer in this battalion, you had to serve time in the ranks. So for much of its existence leading up, you had to enter the battalion as a private or a rifleman and then work your way up before you were even considered for a commission as a 2nd lieutenant. So, and you get some really interesting personalities out of that. They do serve in the Boer War. They send volunteers who end up joining with the 4th Battalion of the Scottish Rifles, which is attached to the 2nd Battalion. And there's always a callback to the service in South Africa. But when war is declared, they also are impacted by Lieutenant Colonel Duff and his decisions, and they get the orders to mobilize while they're at 261 Princes Street. And they mobilized to Falkirk with the rest of the 52nd Lowland Division, which was all of the Lowland Territorials. Afterwards, however, they're one of the battalions that's selected to be sent to France, and they're one of the first territorial battalions to arrive in France, getting there in November of 1914. They're led at the time by this guy. Hopefully this picture works, as I try to bring up some pictures, because he just has—
Can't go any worse than mine.
Oh, yeah. That's the greatest mustache in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go with this guy.
Oh.
We've seen Lieutenant Colonel or Colonel Jeffrey Douglas, the man, the myth, the legend. This man embodies fashion. And, you know, he has my mustache goals. But he's leaves the battalion over. He's still their full dress uniform, even up into 1914, is not the dark green with black buttons of the Cameroonians. It's this gray uniform.
Is this like Elco grey then? Sort of almost sort of like London Scottish territory that we're in, but maybe not with the piggy hue in it,
So even though they were made the 5th Battalion of the Cameroonian Scottish Rifles, they still hang on to a lot of their old Lanarkshire Rifle Volunteers traditions. That dies out after the First World War, and of course, when they actually go into action, they're wearing khaki with black buttons as members of the Scottish Rifles. So, but this man leads the battalion over, and there are a lot of other really interesting personalities. The battalion transport officer is a man at the time known as Lieutenant Reith, who later becomes very, very famous with the BBC in the Second World War as Baron Reith. He is not a fan of Churchill. He's not a fan of this man, Douglas, to the point that in his memoir, which I'll publish a link to after this, he talks about being on leave in Glasgow and seeing Douglas on the street and completely crossing the street so he doesn't have to talk to him. So there's a lot of really strong personalities in this battalion. Douglas, unfortunately, is killed at the Somme, at the Battle of High Wood. But he's also one of the first casualties of the battalion because, as we mentioned earlier, they're referred to as God's own. And when I first got into the Cameroonians, I thought it was because of the tradition of the regiment being a very Presbyterian regiment. That's actually not true. The thing was, they were joined, when they were sent to France as an independent battalion, they joined 19 Brigade, which means they were paired with the 1st Battalion, the Cameroonians, one of the regular battalions. So for the entire war, they had this regular battalion looking over them. And in war diaries, the battalion, the war diary of the brigade refers to the 1st Battalion as the Cameroonians and the 2nd Battalion, as in the 5th Battalion as the Scottish Rifles. So they still kind of keep this difference. They're also paired with the 2nd Royal Welsh Fusiliers, very famous in literary circles, because probably the best documented battalion on the Western Front in the First World War. And they're also paired with the 20th Royal Fusiliers. So there's a really awesome brigade that I love to write about. But serving in France, they're not going to see heavy action. Even though they arrive in November 1914, they spend a lot of their time at a place called Bois Grenier, which is where most of the winter of 1914 and then into 1915. And I'm just going to, everybody's going to see my cool background and stuff.
Because this is the incredible thing, Jim. You know, my father-in-law's, I think it was his great uncle, actually exchanged out of the 5th Cameroonians into the Royal Flying Corps because he was bored. I said,
this is it. And
life certainly got interesting for him in the Royal Flying Corps, as you can imagine. But it goes totally against the grain of what we expect trench warfare to be. The people at large just think that these battalions are hastily raised and just flung in willy-nilly, and it's not the case, is it?
No, and so these battalions, and especially a battalion like the 5th Scottish Rifles, really maintains its identity because from its arrival in November of 1914 in France through to the end of 1915, they're really not engaged in what we would consider to be a pitched battle. They're taking casualties. They're serving in the front line trench. The photograph that I have up now, because everybody see a Cameroonian with some rifles in a trench.
Yeah.
This is one of the 5th over the winter of 1915. And this is what their life is like from the majority of 1915. So they get the moniker of God's own, not because they're blessed for being the greatest battalion whichever served in the British Army, but because they've managed to avoid all of the major battles and massacres of 1915. So they get that moniker, and it's not until 1916, really with the attack on High Wood in the Battle of the Somme, the 15th of July, that they're going to get their first major taste of action, their first major casualties. And that moniker, while it sticks with them through the whole war, kind of goes away during that. And although we could really talk heavily about the individual actions, High Wood, particularly devastating for the battalion, Arras, particularly devastating for the battalion. They're, with the rest of 33rd Division, part of the attacks on the Hindenburg Line in the Second Battle of the Scarpe. They're fighting just south of Polygon Wood at 3rd Ypres, which I'm actually writing a book chapter on right now, the whole action of the 33rd Division.
Which is fine.
Which is fine. But the things that really interest me about this battalion, similar to you guys with your battalions, is the personal stories more than the large battle stories. It's great to talk about the Battle of Polygon Wood, but the thing that attracted me to the 5th Scottish Rifles is, apart from being the best battalion of the British Army which ever existed, they've got really awesome, just small details that kind of impact my study of the First World War. I'm pulling up a section now. Can everybody see? This is out of the battalion history, which was published after the war.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to thank especially, and I will thank again at the end, the Low Parks Museum in Hamilton, and particularly Barry Duncan, one of the curators there, who helped me through all of my master's degree and is continuing on to teach that kind of history there. So next time you're in the greater Glasgow area, make sure to make it to Hamilton and visit the museum, especially when all of this is over, and follow their blog and their Facebook page, which I'll link later. But this is a section from the battalion history, which was published in 1935. And this is talking about the end of November 1917, when they're on the Passchendaele Ridge. This is after the official battles of Passchendaele have ended. The Canadians have taken the village itself, and the 33rd Division come in and relieve the Canadians, sort of taking over that, that moonscape, that just morass that we all imagine with many First World War battles, but particularly with Passchendaele. And they talk about how they'd taken over an abandoned German pillbox, and they turned it into their battalion aid station and started burying bodies around there. The pillbox itself was named Tyne Cot, and from there they just gathered some German dead. They had their first aid post, first aid men in there. They buried Canadians, some Australians, and all of that. Now is Tyne Cot Cemetery, the largest British and Commonwealth cemetery outside of the United Kingdom. That was started by the 5th Scottish Rifles. And a lot of people will argue, well, it's Tyne Cot, it's got a Northumbrian connection. Very likely does, especially given the name of, who gave it that moniker. But if you actually go to Tyne Cot, next time all of our viewers visit Tyne Cot, look at the original graves in a circle around the pillbox monument, and you'll notice a large amount of men of the 5th Scottish Rifles. Mm-hmm. That's because that cemetery was built up around their service. That's just one of the really...
The cross of sacrifice in Tyne Cot is actually built on a pillbox. And take it, this is the pillbox then, yeah?
This is that pillbox. This was the aid station of the Scottish Rifles. It was captured originally by the Australians at the beginning of November. But again, they were in turn relieved by the Canadians, who were in turn relieved by the 33rd Division. And the first Black Watch wasn't too far away at the time as well for Rowan's interests. So you have these amazing personal stories like that continue to bring you in. One of the other ones that I absolutely love, I originally heard of in the battalion history, talks about my favorite member of the battalion. Does everybody see this picture? Pictures up? Yeah. So this is the battalion in 1914. It's titled Hogmanay 1914, right? So for those, weird guys like me who don't have the benefit of being born Scottish, means New Year's. So this is the battalion in their amazing sheepskin coats. You've got Lieutenant Colonel Douglas there sitting, and then you've got the battalion adjutant, Croft, who will rise to command the battalion later on in the war. And then you've personally got my favorite member of the battalion, who's a border collie named Jock.
Oh.
And Jock was found in France in December of 1914. That's when he's officially put on rolls with the battalion. Unfortunately, Jock was killed during the Battle of the Somme. And we love these stories of animals. Some are true, some aren't. In the United States, we have the story of Stubby, who went with the 26th Division, the 102nd Infantry out of Connecticut, and came back and is now the mascot of Georgetown University. And they've also got some fake stories. One of the ones I keep hearing with the Cameroonians is the story of Jimmy the Donkey, who was taken by the 1st Battalion on the first day of the Battle of the Somme and brought back and is buried in England, except that the 1st Battalion didn't take part in the first day of the Battle of the Somme. And a lot of times the photos show Jimmy being taken care of by kilted soldiers, and the Cameroonians, as you could tell, are a trousered regiment. So, but there are these really interesting just bits of regimental history, and these personal stories of men who lived in the same neighborhood that I lived in, worked at the same university that I was studying at, and really motivated me to continue studying and researching is something.
That's it, Jim. It's the houses. When I walk to work, you think, there's Lieutenant such and such about his house, there's Lance Corporal such and such. And it's very strange, you know, once you've found these details out and you think, well, actually, I'll have a look on Google Maps where that is, and you just like, that's 3 minutes walk from my house. It's sort of like, it's difficult not to go past that place and not think about that then, like, you know.
No, and I mean, it still impacts me to this day. Even though I'm back living in the United States, I have a war medal, a victory medal of Private Edward Fraser, who was killed in May 1918. And every time I go over to Ypres, I bring the victory medal with me, put it on the Tyne Cot Memorial where he's listed, and he was a member of the 5th Battalion. So it's always a part of what I study. It's always in the back of my head, even if I'm not writing about the Cameroonians, any part of the regiment. It will always be a really strong part of my life as a historian and as a person who has a, you know, still, even though no longer living there, still call Glasgow and still call Scotland my home. So it's
Ali in exile, mate. You'll be back. Don't worry about it. We're doing everything we can, you know.
But yeah, that's my favorite battalion. And I'm happy you guys could share yours with me. And I think we have a few other things we do want to talk about. Remember when we said this wouldn't take up the full hour? And
we've got like 4 minutes left.
Yeah, that's right. All right then, folks. Just to round up, you may well have seen on the Scots at War page, we've had 2 really good films posted up just over the last couple of days. Rowan, do you want to just tell us about what you've put together there?
Yeah, effectively, we've had various YouTube videos done through the group before, but I want to do something a bit more sort of informative and about aspects of the war which aren't really discussed that much. It basically started because I got a bit bored and wrote about 2,000 words on the attack in extended order and tactics in 1914. Realized that nobody was ever going to want to read it, and thought, all right, okay, we're going to make this into a video, and I'm going to have Hamish go and run about in trees and dive on the ground and stuff and show what it looks like.
Which he's always excited to do.
Yeah.
You don't even need to ask.
Yeah.
That's it, yeah.
So basically, now we're making a series of things using the original manuals and examples from sort of how these tactics were manifested during the war. I've done an appendix to the first video on sort of the commands and hand signals used, which I think will be of use to living historians like us, but also from a general historical perspective, visualizing how a force in this time actually moves over ground. And as we go on, I'm hoping to sort of link these things up to how they work later during the war, how an open warfare tactic from 1914 is manifested at the Somme, and then is developed into something like I was talking about last week at Arras. So hopefully over the next few weeks, or next few, however long we're in this situation for, and hopefully beyond that, we'll carry on. So that basically that's done on a YouTube channel, just done by me, separate from the group, that's called 1914 Subaltern. So if you want to have a look at that, please do.
Yeah.
Everything is still linked to the group, and group members are in all these things anyway. So yeah.
Because that's the whole thing, isn't it? You know, from like a living history perspective, a lot of people, you know, when you're talking to them about Great War tactics, they almost go like, they had tactics and stuff, like, yeah.
But even when you look at something as basic as we hear the constant narrative that people, you know, stood up and walked upright towards machine guns in the First World War, and fair enough, we now know that it wasn't everyone who did that, but of the ones that did, if you look at, there is actually reasoning as early as 1905 as to why they would do that. Because if you walk in an extended line towards the enemy, the range is constantly being shortened, and machine gunners can't just lay the gun on a line and fire along it. They have to be adjusting their sights and wasting time and stuff all the time. So I mean, there are absolute benefits to doing things like that, and that's what the sort of thing that we're going to hopefully be able to visualize more through doing it in videos.
I really
just to close up and put the boot on the other foot, Jim, you were probably going to jump in and say that from sort of like a historical point of view, somebody that's maybe not like perhaps interested in the old living history side of things. What use would there be for sort of like an academic historian to see how an army moved in 1914. You know, is there anything from that point of view, or is it just for us people who like to run about in the khaki? Like,
I think there's absolutely a place for it. There's a really deep academic level study of how the British Army was developing in the years after the Boer War and leading up into the Second Boer War and leading up into the First World War. Great books by Spencer Jones.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Which I think we've mentioned before, but if not, Boer War to World War, amazing book, which covers that. But I've studied this academically. I plan on continuing to work with it academically, but I've always struggled somewhat with, just reading something and taking it in. So visualization and visual learning, doesn't matter what age you are or how experienced you are with the topic, it does always help. It's always something that you need to keep in mind. It's what originally drove my interest in history. I was watching war movies, So it's a more academic version of that, which does really help. What we need to do is recruit more for the group and get a full-size company so you can see it actually done.
Yeah, I mean, that's why we started with the extended order, because you hardly need anyone to do it. But absolutely, there's great benefits. I mean, Spencer Jones's book, The Boer War to World War, is amazing. I've read it several times now. But to do this first video, I really had to go back to the very bare basics of the infantry training manual, the field service regulations, and then take that and put it into context with things that the Royal Fusiliers and the First Black Watch had done at Mons and things. So it's really not. It's really based on primary research. Not there's no opinion in it. It's literally what's in the manual and a couple of instances of how it worked or didn't work.
And it's certainly very interesting to actually get. When you look at this, and you're looking at the regulations and the various training pamphlets. You're like, oh right, so that seems really, really confusing, but that's what they were trying to achieve, And I often find it interesting when you're reading sort of like the regimental histories, and they will say sort of like the battalion moved forward to do etc., etc. And obviously the reader in 1920 or 1923, when they're reading the regimental history, will just know exactly what that would have looked like, because 9 times out of 10, these histories are sort of written for the survivors a wee bit, aren't they? Sort of thing. But
that's another thing. This is something I was just kind of thinking about the other day. Is that when the official British history of the Great War and things were written, the people writing it and the people reading it sort of were reading it for the big picture, but knowing what had happened. And since they've started dying out, we've kind of had. And it's nothing against what's been done. Obviously, there are brilliant works done. Obviously, historians know what happened. But I think it is, it's different. These texts which were written assuming that people knew things, people who are reading them now don't know, if that makes sense. So that's basically, we just got to find a way of making sure people do know that, and then we will know everything.
As a what I call myself a professional historian, but as a professional historian, we're watching the video you had there really helped illustrate one of my favorite accounts of 1914, which is There's a Devil in the Drum. I forget the name of the soldier himself, but he was in the 2nd Royal Irish Rifles. And he describes the advancing at the Battle of the Aisne, following behind his officers under artillery fire, making hand signals. And it really kind of illustrated it for me. I also loved your descriptions of try not to hit yourself with your sword while waving your arm.
I mean, it's just things that you wouldn't consider are actually quite difficult. And even little things like the fact that there's a list of these whistle signals that you can use. And a long drawn out signal like you see in films to signal going over the top is actually listed as the signal for ceasefire. Now, whether that changed during the war or not, I'm not sure. But I did start listening to the old sort of early 1960s BBC interviews with veterans, specifically trying to hear these accounts of them going over the top. And what I noticed is I wasn't able to find any of them talking about whistles, only about getting the order. Nobody really talks about that whistle thing, so I'm not quite sure where that came from. Things like that.
Interesting, very, very interesting, gentlemen. Right, folks, we'll probably draw it to a conclusion there. Thanks to all you folk at home that have been watching us, indeed, from our homes. As ever, if you've got questions, if you've got comments, if you'd like to suggest perhaps a topic that we could investigate and have a little look at next time, you are more than welcome to do so. But other than that, thank you very, very much for tuning in again. Stay safe, stay sane, as we always say, and see you back this time next week. Thank you very much, folks. Thank you. Good evening.